You get whatever it is I need. Say, little butt. Say, little butt.
What, boy?
Say, little butt.
Who pretty? Where?
Like that.
Ah.
Don't joke with me. I smoke with you, joke with you. Goddamn me, live life, baby. You hear me?
Don't start.
She was 6 months pregnant with twins. Just weeks earlier, she had smiled through tears of joy as blue balloons floated into the sky at her gender reveal party. Family clapped, friends cheered, and Darionne Burley thought her life was only beginning. But by the end of June 2020, that same young woman was found slumped in the front seat of a car, a bullet buried in the back of her head. Her unborn boys, gone before they ever took a breath. The man who had stood beside her at the celebration, the man who was supposed to protect her, had become the very reason her family would bury her. Police would call it one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Tarrant County. Her family called it a nightmare that still won't end. What happened between balloons and blood? How does love turn to murder in less than a month? If you believe stories like Darion should never be forgotten, subscribe now, because silence is how tragedies like this keep repeating. And if you refuse to subscribe, explain in the comments why her memory doesn't deserve a place in your life.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
Darionne Burley was 26 years old. She wasn't just a daughter, a sister, or a friend. She was an expectant mother carrying 2 baby boys she already loved beyond words. On the afternoon of June 29, 2020, police in Mansfield, Texas, were dispatched to what they thought was a carjacking. What they found instead was a tragedy. Darionne, lifeless in the passenger seat of a Honda Civic, shot in the back of the head. The small city of Mansfield, tucked against Fort Worth, wasn't accustomed to cases like this. A suburban community, quiet neighborhoods, family restaurants, and middle-class streets. Not the kind of place where a young pregnant woman would be executed in broad daylight. Yet here she was 6 months pregnant, with a sonogram still in her wallet showing twin boys labeled Twin and Twin B. Police quickly realized this was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something darker. And so the central question loomed over investigators, the family, and now us. How did Darionne's promise of motherhood turn into her murder before she even held her children? If her story already unsettles you, imagine how many more women never get their stories told. Subscribe now, because forgetting her is a choice. And if you choose not to subscribe, say why in the comments. Her family deserves to hear your reason. Darionne Burley grew up in Texas, surrounded by people who knew her as warm, giving, and determined. She carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who wanted the best out of life, even when life didn't always hand her the best in return. Friends described her as someone who could walk into a room and make people laugh, even when she was the one under pressure. She was protective of her family, loyal to her friends, and she had a way of making others believe that better days were always possible. When she learned she was pregnant, Darionne threw herself into the idea of motherhood. She talked about names. She shared sonograms proudly. She spoke about building a stable home where her sons could grow up safe, happy, and loved. Her excitement was contagious. Family members said it was like watching her step fully into her purpose. Social media showed glimpses of that joy. Photos of her glowing with expectation, short captions about gratitude, and subtle hints at the hopes she had for the 2 lives growing inside of her. To those who knew her best, the twins were not just babies on the way. They were the reason she was working harder, planning bigger, and dreaming wider. Every detail about Darionne's life pointed in the same direction. A young woman on the edge of a new chapter, one she believed would finally bring her stability and joy. But what she didn't know was that the same person standing closest to her would become the reason she'd never get to see it. Standing at the center of Darionne Burley's world during those months was a man named Maurice Kelso Smith. To outsiders, he appeared to be the expectant father of her unborn children, the one who stood beside her at the gender reveal party, the one who smiled as the balloons lifted into the air. But behind the photographs and behind the public moments was a darker story. Maurice was not a stranger to struggle. He had a criminal record, and by 2020, his life was already spiraling. Friends of Darion would later testify that his moods were unpredictable. Some days he was calm, even charming, the kind of man who could convince a young woman that he cared. But other days, he sank deep into heavy drug use, consumed synthetic marijuana and harder substances that left him paranoid and violent. By early June, his behavior was turning more threatening. Prosecutors would later reveal that he had assaulted Darion while she was carrying the twins, an attack that should have been a clear warning sign of what was coming. For her family, it confirmed what they had feared, that the relationship was becoming dangerous, that she was tied to a man who wasn't stable enough to handle fatherhood or the responsibilities that came with it. Yet the contradiction remained. Just weeks before the murder, Maurice himself organized the gender reveal party, an event that prosecutors later described as joyful. It was a carefully staged performance of happiness, balloons and smiles hiding the storm that was building inside him. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Because in those photographs from May, Darionne is radiant, her hands resting on her stomach, laughing with friends who had gathered to celebrate. But Maurice? Look closely. His smile doesn't quite reach his eyes. Behind the celebration, something inside him was already breaking. By late June, it became undeniable. Maurice tried to legally purchase a gun, but failed the background check. Instead of seeing that as a barrier, he turned to a friend at a gun show, arranging an illegal sale that placed a .40 caliber pistol in his hands. That weapon would seal Darionne's fate. To the outside world, he was still her boyfriend. To her family, he was already a growing threat. To Darionne herself, he was the father of her children. And it was that combination, love, loyalty, fear, and denial, that left her in the most vulnerable position of all. On the morning of June 29th, 2020, the day began like any other, ordinary enough to hide what was coming. Surveillance timestamps would later place them together at a diner on the Fort Worth side of the Metroplex. Two people sharing a table, the kind of quiet routine that never draws a second glance. They walked out together, stepped into the same car, and pulled onto the road. What happened next moved quickly, almost methodically. Within the hour, the quiet routine snapped. Inside that car, the balance of power shifted to a man who had already crossed too many lines in the weeks prior. There were no witnesses close enough to hear the words that preceded the violence. No neighbor standing near an open window to describe an argument. No passerby to capture a final plea. There was only a driver's seat, a passenger seat, and a decision that ended a future. The car kept moving. He didn't stop. He didn't call for help. He drove with purpose, leaving one part of the city and entering another, tracing a path south toward Mansfield. His focus was no longer on the woman beside him. It was on escape. At an exit that feeds into commercial frontage and service roads, he made his next move, a sudden threat, a gun displayed, a stranger forced out of her own vehicle. He left one car behind and took another, shedding evidence as if switching skins. Somewhere in that stretch of late morning, phones that once held messages of everyday life became silent placeholders. There were calls that would never connect, alerts that would never be answered, plans that would never be kept. The ordinary rhythms of her day, checking in, confirming schedules, sharing small moments, went dark without explanation. The only rhythm that remained belonged to the man already planning what he would clean, what he would hide, and what he would pretend not to remember. He pushed on from that first robbery to a second attempt nearby, the pattern of a man accelerating rather than recoiling, testing whether fear could keep others compliant while he bought himself more time. Traffic rolled past, storefronts opened, and closed doors for customers. And all the while, the story he was writing for himself depended on speed and bleach and a lie he intended to tell later. Hour by hour, the city kept its schedule, Midday commuters, lunch breaks, a sky that gave no sign of the damage done below it. And inside that shifting trail of vehicles and service roads was a single, unbreakable truth. What had already happened inside that first car would not be undone by distance or a new set of keys. The clock did not care about his next errand or his next alibi. It moved forward without mercy. By late morning into early afternoon, his path bent back toward home. Not to surrender, not to confess, to erase. The plan was basic and brutal. Remove what can be seen, disguise what can be smelled, destroy what can be traced. It is the kind of plan that imagines time as a cleanser and underestimates what investigators learn and notice, what lingers in carpet fibers, what glows under chemical light, what refuses to wash away. This is the part where most of us want to believe someone notices sooner. The neighbor who senses something wrong, the friend who drives over, the officer who happens upon a car abandoned where it shouldn't be. But that's the cruelty of real life. The first people to understand the shape of day like this are often the last people who ever wanted to know. If you're still here, listening, and you feel that pull in your chest, the one that says stories like this cannot be swallowed and forgotten, subscribe now. If you choose not to, say why in the comments. Say why the silence feels safer than standing with her. It was early afternoon in Mansfield, Texas. The call came in as something routine, a carjacking, a stolen vehicle, a shaken victim who'd just been forced out of her own car. Officers responded quickly, expecting the kind of scene they had seen before, a frightened citizen, paperwork, a stolen car report. But within minutes, something else demanded their attention. Just down the service road from the reported carjacking, near the 1600 block of North US 287 Frontage Road, a gray Honda Civic sat abandoned. It looked like a car left behind in a hurry. No Hasselflashing, no attempt to conceal it. Just a vehicle sitting wrong in the midday heat. When officers approached, the sight inside shifted the day from routine to horrific. In the passenger seat sat a young woman. She wasn't moving. Blood had matted her hair against the headrest. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the interior, sharp and unmistakable. One shell casing gleamed faintly against the carpet, the cold signature of a single shot fired. As they opened the door, the details only grew more chilling. On the floorboard, her wallet. Inside, a sonogram from June 15th, two small figures outlined in black and white, labeled Twin A and Twin B. Her babies. Beside it, a backpack belonging not to her, but to the man police would soon confirm as her boyfriend, the father of those twins. Tucked inside that bag was a ticket stub from a Fort Worth gun show, dated just one day earlier. This was no robbery gone wrong, no random act of violence. This was a crime scene staged by time and evidence, leaving officers with a timeline that was rapidly coming into focus. The first responders had no way to soften what they were about to tell her family. A daughter, a sister, a mother-to-be, gone in an instant. And not just her. The twin boys she carried were gone with her, never given the chance to draw first breath. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Mansfield's police radio, drawing in detectives and crime scene investigators. Cameras flashed. Measurements were taken. Samples collected. Every item in that car mattered. The casing, the ticket, the smell, the blood. But evidence could only explain part of the story. The rest, the motive, the betrayal, the decision to pull a trigger, would take days of interviews and the slow, methodical work of piecing together a life cut short. And here lies the unsettling truth. When law enforcement finds a crime scene like this, what they see isn't just the blood, the bullet, the silence of a victim. They see the ripple it will cause. The family waiting for a call, the children never born, the community about to learn that safety is thinner than it appears. If you think this case is painful to hear, imagine being one of those officers, standing in that Texas heat, staring a young woman who still had a hospital band and her wallet showing the proof of her babies. Stories like this must be remembered. Subscribe now. Or if you won't, tell us in the comments why her name should fade into silence. From the moment detectives stepped onto that crime scene in Mansfield, the evidence began to speak louder than words. A single .40 caliber shell casing lay on the floorboard of the abandoned Honda Civic, glinting in the light. It told them the shot had been fired inside the car, point blank, leaving no chance of survival. The Civic itself became a crime lab on wheels. A backpack inside carried a gun show ticket dated just one day before the shooting, linking directly to the purchase of the weapon used to kill. Investigators knew Maurice Smith had tried to buy a gun legally and failed his background check. The stub in his bag was proof that he had found another way, an illegal sale through a friend who acted as a straw buyer. When detectives entered Smith's apartment hours later, the pieces fell into place. A pistol hidden under the mattress later matched ballistically to the casing from the Civic. Clothing and a washcloth soaked with blood. A bottle of bleach, the air still sharp from cleaning chemicals. And, parked outside, the stolen SUV he was scrubbing down when officers closed in. But perhaps most telling of all was his behavior after arrest. At the hospital, he pretended to be overdosing, claimed he could not remember, tried to slip out of his restraints by picking at the handcuffs tethering him to the bed. Investigators saw through it. This wasn't confusion. It was evasion. A man cornered by the evidence, acting out one last desperate play. To prosecutors, the case was clear. This was not a crime of passion. This was premeditation. He secured a gun he wasn't allowed to have. He carried it into that car, and within 24 hours of holding the weapon, he pulled the trigger on the woman carrying his children. But evidence and testimony were only part of the story. The weight of the trial was carried most heavily by Darion's family, who sat through each detail with broken hearts. They listened to forensic experts describe the trajectory of a bullet. They watched as sonogram images of the unborn twins were displayed in a courtroom. Two tiny silhouettes labeled Twin A and Twin B, never given the chance to live. And when the verdict was read, guilty of capital murder, the family found themselves face to face with the man who had shattered them. There was no sense of victory, no celebration. One relative spoke words that echoed through the silence of the courtroom. There are no winners here. They reminded the world of the life Darion had imagined. Boys running through her home, laughter filling rooms, the warmth of a mother's arms wrapping them close. They remembered her joy at hearing she would be a mother of twins, the excitement in her voice as she planned for their future. And they grieved the cruel reality that those voices would never be heard, those sons would never be held, and their mother would never see the life she had dreamed of unfold. Outside the courthouse, friends and community members held candles, their faces lit in the night, speaking her name aloud so it would not vanish into statistics. Online, tributes poured in. Strangers who had never met her felt compelled to write messages of solidarity, unable to look away from the injustice of a young mother cut down before she could begin the most important chapter of her life. For her family, the pain was permanent. For the community, the memory was a warning. And for all of us, it left a question that lingers long after the trial ended. How many signs do we overlook before it is too late? If you can hear a family say through their tears, "There are no winners here," and still stay silent, ask yourself why. Subscribe now to make sure Darion's story is carried forward, so that her name and the names of her unborn sons are not erased by time. And if you won't subscribe, write your reason in the comments, because silence in the face of their pain is its own kind of answer. The courthouse in Tarrant County became the stage where every hidden truth of this case was finally laid bare. It was not just another trial. It was a collision between the evidence collected on a hot Texas afternoon and the grief of a family who had already endured too much. Maurice Kelso Smith entered the courtroom dressed in prison-issued clothes, his demeanor flat, his expression betraying little. But prosecutors Elena Bangs and Kate Inohoso were ready. They stood before the jury and painted the picture of a man whose decline was swift and deadly, a man who, in the span of 1 month, moved from celebrating fatherhood to committing a murder that silenced not just one heartbeat, but 3. One by one, the evidence was introduced. Photographs of the abandoned Honda Civic, the shell casing gleaming on the floorboard. The sonogram pulled from Darion's wallet, showing the outline of the twins she would never hold. The pistol recovered from under Smith's mattress matched scientifically to the casing left in the car. The backpack with the gun show ticket that prosecutors said tied him to a weapon obtained illegally just 24 hours before the shooting. Jurors listened as crime scene investigators described the smell of bleach that hung in the air of his apartment. They heard how officers found the stolen SUV still wet from his cleaning, the bloody clothes tucked away but never fully destroyed. They watched footage from inside the hospital where Smith feigned overdose symptoms, tried to play confused, even attempted to pick the lock on his handcuffs while chained to a hospital bed. This wasn't just about a bullet. It was about a pattern. A man using drugs heavily, lashing out at his pregnant girlfriend weeks before the shooting, securing a weapon when the law told him he could not have one, and then carrying through with violence when there was no one else in the car to stop him. The defense offered little that could soften the mountain of evidence. They could not erase the ballistic match. They could not undo the testimony of carjacking victims who pointed directly at Smith. They could not explain away the bleach, the blood, or the lies. And so the weight fell on the jury. 12 men and women who sat in silence as they studied sonogram images of unborn children, as they listened to Darionne's family describe her joy in preparing for motherhood, as they looked into the eyes of a man who had thrown it all away. When the verdict was announced, guilty of capital murder, the room carried a stillness that words can't capture. There was no outburst, no dramatic scene. Just the sound of family breathing through tears and a community understanding that justice, though delivered, would never feel like enough. Under Texas law, because the state had waived the death penalty, the sentence was automatic. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Smith would never walk free again. He would never see another sunrise outside prison walls. And for Darionne's family, there was some measure of permanence in knowing he would not return to harm another. But the sentence did not erase the loss. Family members stood in the courtroom and addressed him directly. Their words were not designed to heal him. They were designed to remind him of what he had taken. One relative said, "There are no winners here." Another spoke of the future Darionne had imagined. 2 little boys chasing each other through the house, laughter filling the air, the sound of their mother calling them to the table. A future that existed in her heart, but would never exist in reality. The courtroom became more than a place of judgment. It became a place of memory, a place where a young woman's name was spoken aloud, so it would not fade into silence, and where the gravity of her absence could be felt by everyone present. If you hear this and you still hesitate to act, remember this. Families like Darionne's don't get second chances. They don't get to turn back time. All they have left is the hope that people like you will remember, will care, and will speak her name. Subscribe now, so her story and others like it don't disappear. And if you won't subscribe, then tell us in the comments why her family's grief is not enough for you. Maurice Kelso Smith did not vanish quietly into the prison system. Even after his conviction, he tried to fight. His attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that the law which forced life without parole when the death penalty was waived was unconstitutional. They claimed it robbed him of the chance to plead for leniency, that it stripped away the possibility of a jury weighing his fate. But in May of 2025, the Fifth Court of Appeals delivered its answer. The conviction stood. The sentence was affirmed. The judges were clear. The statute did not violate his rights. The law was the law, and Smith would never again see the outside of prison yard. For Darionne's family, the appeal was not a surprise. They had expected him to grasp at whatever thread he could find. But the ruling brought finality. There would be no parole hearing 20 years down the line, no new trial decades later, no chance of a retrial reopening wounds. He would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls and locked gates, living with the consequences of the trigger he pulled on June 29, 2020. And yet, finality is not closure, because no ruling, no sentence, no appellate opinion can bring back what was stolen. The last images of Darionne alive were from a celebration. Balloons in the air, smiles on faces, hope captured in photographs. Weeks later, investigators were collecting those same balloons as evidence of what her life was supposed to be, contrasted against the blood left in the passenger seat of a car. That is the cruelty of this story. joy interrupted by violence, promise interrupted by betrayal. Her family still speaks her name. They remember her laughter, the excitement she carried when she learned she was carrying not one, but 2 sons. They imagine what those boys might have looked like today. Their first steps, their first words, the way they would have filled a home with noise and life. They carry the grief of knowing none of it will ever happen. And so the responsibility falls to us, to remember her, to tell her story, to ensure her name is not another line buried under headlines about violence against women that are forgotten the moment the next tragedy strikes. If you have watched this far, then you already know why you cannot stay silent. Stories like Darion's matter because they are not rare. They are warnings, lessons written in blood about what happens when abuse, addiction, and violence are ignored until it is too late. Subscribe now so that her story and others like it will never fade into silence. If you choose not to, then step into the comments and explain why. Tell us why the memory of a young woman and her unborn sons doesn't deserve to live on. For Darionne Burley, for her twin boys, for every woman who fears the man she once trusted. Their names must not be forgotten. Their stories must not be erased. And their lives must remind us that silence is complicity. This is not just true crime. This is a plea. Remember her.
It's breaking down on me.